We're back here at the FT Global Commodity Summit in Lausanne. I'm honored to be joined by Tom Wilson, Natural Resource Editor for the FT and also the host for this week. Tom, there's a lot of really interesting topics being covered this week in Lausanne. You know, major lists of developments in global commodities trading, talking about energy transition, AI, technological advances, geopolitical tensions, war, everything else. I was curious, when you were putting together the agenda for the week, you know, how are you thinking about what you wanted to cover and what you wanted people to get out of the conference this year?
I mean, I think to your points there that you made in posing that question, you got to the heart of what we've been talking about this week, is just how complex the commodity trading landscape has become. So you have this intersection of geopolitical change, regulatory change, and then energy system change, and kind of one layered on top of the other means there are a huge new number of variables and dislocations in the market which are affecting the way in which commodities move around the world. I mean, in other industries, one might say, oh God, that's a problem for business. I mean, the thing about the commodity trading sector in particular is that traders thrive in those dislocations. And so we've seen those disruptions result in huge profits for the sector over the last 2 years. I mean, all of the privately held traders here have seen massive jumps in their profitability. So, I mean, circling back to your question, I mean, I think in putting together the agenda, we wanted to really try and draw out the big themes, identify kind of how the world had changed, and then kind of throw it forward and ask, you know, whether the last 2 years are kind of a unique moment, driven principally by the war in Russia. Was there something kind of unique about in the characteristics about Russia and that war, which led to the levels of disruption we've seen? Or are we actually going to see this level of disruption either sustained or repeating on itself over the next 10, 20 years? And that's, I guess, the question that we're trying to answer.
Yeah, I found there's an interesting panel this morning. I think you were the one hosting it on. A lot of the conversation was around, is this level of volatility normal or not normal? Like, is this something we're all accustomed to and it's just been a little bit higher the past few years? Or is there something fundamentally different? Is this just a natural cycle that commodity traders are accustomed to? Or are we seeing really profound shifts that are going to change the way we do business in the future? And I'm curious, you know, as you kind of sit back and take a look at it, how do you come down on the cycle versus shift discussion?
Look, I think there's a cyclical element to disruption in commodity markets, definitely. And on that panel, you talk about we had two traders, an economist and a consultant. And the two traders were slightly more slightly more comfortable in this kind of risk landscape. Yeah. So they were more inclined to say, look, we've seen disruption before, it's our bread and butter. But the economist, interestingly, was saying, no, there's more fundamental change. And I kind of tend to agree with her. I think that, and that's in the energy transition in particular. I mean, what are the kind of we're seeing a couple of trends there. I mean, we're basically over the next 30 years, we're going to see a massive shift in the way in which we consume energy. So that is going to result in a whole new kind of suite of energy products being consumed by the world. So more power in time, kind of more biofuels, more synthetic fuels, more hydrogen. That's going to require more metals to be produced in order to kind of build out lots of that, lots of those commodities. So I mean, I think that is kind of underpinning this, and I think that is kind of a fundamental change. I think also, customers are becoming more concerned about the provenance and content of the commodities that they consume, either for political reasons, i.e. now I don't want a barrel of oil from Russia because of the sanctions and the kind of moral position that the West has kind of taken on the war in Ukraine, or because of regulatory reasons. So because of a need to kind of cut emissions, since they want to know the kind of carbon content. And I mean, I think these are things that consumers of commodities weren't thinking about in the same way as if we were back 15 years ago. And as a result, if you go back to, say, the 1990s, I think probably more likely that a commodity was just going to move in the most efficient way possible from A to B over the kind of shortest supply line to command the highest price. But now there are these other considerations which are going to force commodities to move around the world in a more kind of less efficient way. And then commodity traders are going to need to step in to help manage that.
And I wanted to ask, you raised two really important points, and I wanted to ask you how it affects, you in your role as an editor for natural resources at the FT. And that is, one, the range of natural resources that impact your reader is really broadening out. There's so many, whether it's looking at the battery metals and people needing to understand lithium and cobalt markets and nickel markets in ways they probably didn't need to, 5 years ago. And then also that when you look at the provenance of commodities, a trader might want to know where the particular commodity they're buying came from, but probably the person on the street's also more interested of, okay, what are the implications of the things I'm buying every day in terms of the environment and the other things I care about? How is that affecting how you're thinking about, your coverage of the sector?
Yep. I mean, I think the last point you made in particular is kind of particularly pertinent, that the person on the street is getting more interested about the provenance and content of the materials they're consuming. For someone who writes about energy commodities, that's a really positive thing, because it means that, a corporate story about a copper producer might be relevant to the general reader in a way that it potentially wasn't 10 years ago. And which is exciting for us as journalists, or at least those kind of in my team, because when you're writing stories, you can write them for a broader audience. And so I think that's been a really important development. I mean, I think in general, in terms of the FT's energy and commodities coverage, we've covered this sector for decades. I mean, I presume we've covered this sector since we were founded in the late 19th century. I do think probably, though, that if you went back to, say, the kind of post-financial crisis, 2008, through to even the end of the last decade, there was a sense, at least in kind of the West, that the world was moving post-industrial. And that, what were people interested in? People were interested in the latest technology. People were interested in the latest social media platform. And I think that to some extent manifested itself at the FT. When we were hiring new reporters, it was often, let's have a crypto reporter, kind of, for example. And then, really Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis that followed reshaped the conversation, and suddenly people were saying, oh wow, there's actually this stuff called commodities, and there's this commodity called gas, and it comes from Russia on a pipeline to Europe, and did everybody know about this?
It got very real.
Yeah, it got very real again. And look, and I think that's been good for look, that's manifest here in a number of ways. I feel like this conference is bigger than it's ever been before. It feels it's always been a great summit, but it feels kind of year after year increasingly dynamic. And that's been kind of good for our coverage. I do think in general we're writing more about these sectors. And Martin Wolf, the FT's kind of well-known economics columnist at the Speaker Dinner last night, he gave some introductory remarks where he spoke about that trend that I've just been describing, and the fact that the last few years had re-demonstrated the importance of stuff in the world, and that commodity traders are key to that, because they either produce the stuff or move it around the world, and without that stuff, that we can't. That's the building blocks of the economy. And there is a sense potentially that parts of the West maybe kind of forgot that at some point last decade.
Absolutely. There's been a big focus on the technology. The stuff is always important. I think one of the great parts of the discussions here as well has been the stuff beneath the technology. So people will talk about AI, and they'll also talk about the data centers and all the power that's needed, and the impact that'll have on copper demand to make sure that's all available so the rest of us can kind of float above it. I was curious, there's been a lot of conversation on panels about the impact of new technologies like AI on commodities business. I'm curious if it's impacting how you cover the commodity sector.
Not yet, but I think it will be. Look, I think it's early days for that, but it's been a key topic of conversation here. So I think definitely in our reporting, we'll be looking to try and dig into that and understand that better. We've done interviews this week, for example, with Seb Barrack, head of commodities at Citadel. As one would expect for one of the world's biggest hedge funds, they've taken a very data-driven approach to the way in which they trade commodities. And speaking to him, it's very interesting to hear the competitive advantage that he believes the data sets that they have kind of built and have access to, in their ability to parse and kind of compute that data, the impact he believes that has on their ability to trade commodities. So I think as a newspaper, we'll definitely be trying to understand that better. Russell Hardy, in my onstage interview just now, kind of talked about an AI arms race. So it's clear that all the commodity traders, I think, how are going to harness technology. And then I think the second component of that is the huge pull on power resources, on electricity, that AI and just kind of increased computing is going to have. And that does worry me a little bit, actually. I mean, we think about energy demand, kind of electricity demand today, and how much we need to scale up electricity infrastructure to replace fossil fuel demand in order to hit net zero by 2050. I mean, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that anyway, given growing power demand, particularly in the developing South. If you then throw onto that a whole lot of AI technology, which also needs to be powered, it's kind of another drain on this kind of constrained power supply. So I think that's something for kind of policymakers to kind of think about as some of these economies, as the US, for example, kind of pushes into the AI, that could end up with further competition for scarce electricity.
Absolutely. Well, wanted to thank you for having us here at the event. I think this is your second year as the host, more or less. And I wanted to ask you before you go, this has always been one of the preeminent commodities conferences, really kind of has a preeminent place in people's calendars, I think, to make sure they come here. I'm curious, as you think out the next few years, is there certain directions, certain opportunities you see in a world of increased AI, increased interest in stuff, increased importance of having these kind of conversations? Is there a certain directions you want to take the conference in?
No, look, I think the format is pretty strong. I mean, we've always had incredibly strong participation from the industry. So we have the CEOs of the 5 kind of biggest kind of independent trading houses in the world. We have a lot of other senior executives from the sector. I mean, I think one thing we can potentially do more, and we'll probably try and do, is kind of bring policymakers and politicians into the discussion, maybe to reflect the fact that they're now suddenly more aware of the importance and centrality of this sector to their own national security. So, I mean, one small example of that, yesterday I interviewed the US Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources, Jeffrey Pyatt, and really interesting to hear the kind of view from Washington. And I think it would be useful for the attendees here and the executives to also hear from more people like him with kind of senior political and policy positions in some of the largest economies. I mean, and equally, look, I mean, one thing I think any of Western-based newspaper or news organization or kind of corporate can do is better reflect views from the rest of the world. It is always difficult to try and pull kind of those voices in, but it's imperative. Take China. It's the biggest consumer of primary energy in the world, biggest producer of many of the kind of processed metals that we need for the energy transition. So I mean, as a newspaper, we're always trying to kind of reflect views from Delhi, from Beijing, from Jakarta, and to the extent that we can get those voices here as well, I think it'll be positive for the future.
That'd be terrific. Well, thanks for having us here. We've enjoyed all the voices you've gathered for this year. It's been a fantastic conference and looking forward to the last day or two of it.
Thanks, David.
Thanks so much,
Thanks
Tom.
a lot.